The Cook County courtroom in Chicago was cold and sterile on that overcast November morning. Heavy gray clouds pressed against the tall windows, matching the grim atmosphere inside. My parents, Robert and Linda, sat across from me, their high-priced attorney shuffling a stack of legal documents with clinical precision. As the judge cleared his throat, the air grew thick with tension. Then came the ruling that shattered my world. Every major asset from my grandfather Thomas's estate, the luxury Lincoln Park brownstone, the pristine Ford F-150, and the entire diversified stock portfolio, was awarded to them. I watched as my mother, Linda, let out a slow, polished breath. She didn't cheer, she simply offered a small, triumphant smirk, knowing I had been systematically erased from the legacy. In their eyes, I was walking away with nothing. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked shut behind us, but the silence between my family was even louder. My father, Robert, adjusted his silk tie, the keys to my grandfather's Ford F-150 already jingling in his pocket. He turned to me, his expression a mix of pity and cold dismissal, and handed over a single, rusted brass key attached to a faded tag. "The West Cabin," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge of irony. "It's all yours, Sarah. 5 acres of deep brush in the Arkansas Ozarks. This was my inheritance, a rotting one-room hunting shack buried miles past the nearest paved road." The legal description was a joke. No running water, no electricity, and a corrugated tin roof so rusted it looked like it was held together by prayer and red dirt. It was a place meant for hiding, not for living, completely severed from the modern world I had grown up in. My mother, Linda, leaned in, her perfume cloying in the damp November air. She didn't offer a hug, only a sharp, polished smile. "I told the lawyer not to fight you for it," she whispered. "After all, Thomas always knew you had a soft spot for old things. Consider it a sentimental souvenir." They walked toward the elevators, laughing about floor plans for the Lincoln Park house, leaving me standing in the hallway with nothing but a rusted key and the realization that my own parents had just handed me a piece of junk to ensure I'd never bother them again. By the time I navigated my beat-up sedan through the winding, sleet-covered roads of the Arkansas Ozarks, it was already Thanksgiving night. The rest of the country was carving turkeys and sharing warm memories, but I was gripping a frozen steering wheel, driving further into a dead zone where the cell signal completely vanished. When my headlights finally swept across the property, my heart sank. The West Cabin was even worse than my father had gleefully described. It sat in a clearing of overgrown brush, looking like a forgotten relic. The front door groaned in protest as I forced the rusted key into the lock. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, carrying the heavy, suffocating scent of rotting cedar wood and decades-old ash from a cracked cast-iron stove. There was no electricity, no running water, and only a sagging cot in the corner. I spent that first night wrapped in my winter coat, shivering under a single scratchy blanket, listening to the wind tear at the rusted tin roof. But as I stared into the dark, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. This cabin didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was honest in its ruin. Unlike my family, who wore designer suits while picking my grandfather's bones clean, they gave me this place because they believed it was absolutely worthless. If you were completely abandoned by your family and left with nothing but a rotting cabin, would you walk away in silence, or would you start planning your fight back? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. For the first 5 days, surviving in the cabin took every ounce of my energy. I cleared out mouse nests, hauled fresh water from a nearby frozen creek, and kept the old cast-iron stove burning just to prevent frostbite. But on the 6th night, a massive winter storm rolled through the Ozarks. The wind was howling so fiercely that the entire cabin shook, and a sharp, freezing draft kept hitting my neck from the back wall. I held up my battery-powered lantern to investigate and noticed the source, a wide gap hidden right behind an ugly, faded painting of a hunter aiming his rifle. The painting had bothered me since the day I arrived because it hung awkwardly crooked, as if someone had rushed to put it back up. Annoyed by the draft, I lifted the heavy wooden frame off its rusted nail. As soon as it came down, my breath caught in my throat. The wall behind it wasn't solid wood. Someone had meticulously cut a shallow, hidden compartment straight into the supporting studs. My hands trembled as I reached inside the dark, hollow space. My fingers brushed against thick paper. I pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed logo of Chase Bank. It was heavily sealed with wax, untouched by the dampness of the cabin, but it was the writing on the front that made my blood run ice cold. In my grandfather Thomas's unmistakable, shaky handwriting, there was a single, chilling instruction: open this only after they think they have captured the entire world. The moment I read those words, I knew this wasn't just a forgotten piece of mail. I sat on the edge of the dusty cot, the lantern flickering violently as I stared at the sealed envelope. My grandfather never did anything by accident. If he hid this behind a crooked painting in a freezing cabin, he did it to ensure my parents would never find it. Taking a deep breath, I broke the wax seal. Inside was a 4-page handwritten letter and a smaller brass safe deposit key. I unfolded the crisp paper, and my grandfather's voice seemed to echo in the silent room. "Sarah," the letter began, "if Robert and Linda walked out of that Chicago courtroom smiling, then the probate hearing went exactly the way I planned. I knew their greed would blind them. I knew they would fight you tooth and nail for the Lincoln Park house, the cars, and the shiny investment accounts. Let them have the visible wealth. 2 years ago, when your father started treating my life like an inconvenient waiting period, I quietly moved my true legacy out of the public eye." He went on to explain that he had established a private, irrevocable family trust. The West cabin wasn't a punishment for me, it was a brilliant legal decoy. It was a ghost asset, deliberately designed to look like garbage so my parents would throw it at me without a second thought, effectively blinding them to the real power I now held. Grandpa Thomas set a brilliant trap for his own greedy son. What kind of secret weapon do you think he hid inside this trust? A massive hidden fortune or a legal masterstroke for revenge? Drop your best guess in the comments before I reveal the truth. Tucked behind my grandfather's letter was a heavy, folded surveyor's map stamped with a county seal. As I spread it across the wooden floor under the glow of the lantern, the true brilliance of Grandpa Thomas's strategy finally revealed itself. The legal deed my parents handed me at probate proudly stated I owned the West cabin and 5 acres, but the official trust survey proved that was a massive, deliberate misdirection. The trust I now controlled didn't just own the cabin, it owned the entire 120-acre perimeter surrounding it. My eyes traced the thick red boundary lines on the map, and my jaw dropped. My parents had inherited a massive, highly valuable commercial farm and a stone quarry in the valley below, but my 120 acres wrapped completely around their property like a fortress wall. I owned the only paved access road that connected their land to the state highway. Even more devastating, my trust held the absolute primary groundwater rights for the entire region. The springs that fed their commercial farm originated on my land. Grandpa hadn't just left me a piece of real estate, he had left me the circulatory system of their entire empire. Without my legal permission to use that road or tap into that water, their multi-million-dollar inheritance was completely paralyzed. They held the title to a shiny sports car, but I owned the engine, the tires, and the only road out of town. The realization hit me like a freight train. My parents thought they had banished me to the wilderness, but they had actually handed me the absolute authority to destroy their financial future. First thing Monday morning, I drove straight to the First National Bank in downtown St. Louis. The branch manager had been expecting me. She escorted me into a secure, windowless conference room and placed a heavy metal lockbox on the table. When I used the brass key from the cabin to open it, I finally saw the full scope of my grandfather's hidden empire. Inside was the official trust binder, accompanied by a certified asset valuation sheet. The numbers on the page blurred my vision. The total net worth of the trust wasn't a few $1,000s. It was $3.2 million in liquid assets and untouched timber royalties. But the most explosive document was a pending municipal contract. The County Water Authority had offered $1.1 million just to lease a fraction of my groundwater rights for a public project. My grandfather had paused the deal, leaving the final signature to me. Pinned to the front of the binder was a bright red security notice drafted by his legal team. It explicitly instructed the bank that any inquiry, phone call, or physical visit from Robert or Linda Miller was to be immediately denied, and if they persisted, the bank was ordered to call the police for trespassing. He had built an impenetrable financial fortress around me. They had humiliated me in that Chicago courtroom, fighting over stocks and a house, while I was now sitting on a multi-million-dollar cash reserve and the ultimate veto power over their lives. I carefully packed the documents into my bag. I didn't just survive the Ozarks, I walked out of them as the most powerful person in the Miller family. It only took 3 weeks for the illusion of my parents' victory to violently shatter. Robert and Linda had immediately tried to cash in on their inheritance, negotiating a $2 million buyout with a commercial real estate developer who wanted to turn their valley land into a luxury resort. They were already picking out new cars and planning European vacations. But when the developer's title company ran a deep background check, they hit a massive legal brick wall. The title agents discovered the restrictive covenants tied to the West Cabin Trust. The bank immediately froze the $2 million transaction. The developers realized they couldn't bring in construction equipment because they had no legal right to use the access road. They couldn't build a resort because they had zero rights to the groundwater. Their multi-million-dollar valley estate was essentially a landlocked, useless island. My parents' high-priced attorney furiously tried to find a loophole, but Grandpa Thomas's paperwork was ironclad. As my own trust attorney brilliantly explained it, your parents walked away with the visible land, but Sarah, you hold the functional land. The bank denied their commercial loan applications. The developers pulled their lucrative offer off the table entirely. The pristine estate my mother had smiled so smugly about in probate was rapidly becoming a massive financial liability, draining them with property taxes they could no longer afford to pay. Their shiny inherited empire was collapsing in real time, suffocating under the weight of the exact same trust they had unknowingly handed to me along with a rusted brass key. The trap had perfectly sprung. Exactly at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, my phone finally rang. It was my father. The arrogance that usually defined his voice was completely gone, replaced by a tight, suffocating panic. "Sarah," he stammered, abandoning any pretense of a greeting. "The bank froze our land sale. They're saying we don't have road or water access. Tell your lawyers to release the easement rights immediately." I sat on the porch of the cabin, looking out over my 120 acres of timber, and took a slow sip of coffee. "I can't do that, Robert," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "The trust strictly forbids it." He exploded, threatening to sue me, claiming I was stealing their inheritance. When the anger didn't work, my mother got on the line, crying, begging me to be reasonable, pleading that they would go bankrupt if the deal fell through. I let her cry for exactly 10 seconds before cutting her off. "I'm just following administrative procedure, Mom," I said, throwing her lawyer's exact words from the courtroom right back into her face. "But if you want to negotiate, here are my terms." I demanded a legally binding addendum to the probate record, forcing them to publicly admit they had no functional control over their estate. Furthermore, I demanded the immediate return of Grandpa Thomas's war medals, his journals, and every personal item they had selfishly boxed up to sell. "You have exactly 24 hours to comply," I whispered into the receiver, "or I permanently lock the gates to the road." I hung up the phone before they could utter another word, leaving them to drown in the silence. In the end, my parents had no choice but to surrender. They signed the legal addendum, publicly admitting their inheritance was completely dependent on my trust, and quietly returned every single one of Grandpa's keepsakes. Their grand commercial buyout collapsed entirely, leaving them trapped with a massive, unsellable property they couldn't afford to maintain. As for the $1.1 million municipal water deal, I declined it. I didn't need the county's money. Instead, I established the 120-acre perimeter as a protected nature reserve, permanently ensuring no corporate developer would ever touch Grandpa Thomas's woods. I kept the rusted West cabin exactly as it was, a quiet, honest monument to the man who outsmarted them all. The most valuable thing Grandpa left me wasn't the millions sitting in the bank. It was the ultimate power to say no to the people who betrayed me. True wealth isn't what you can show off to the world. It's the absolute control over your own destiny. Would you have taken the millions, or would you choose the power to control the fate of those who wronged you? If you loved how Grandpa Thomas trapped them in their own greed, hit that like button and subscribe.